focusing on population of individuals of that species. We are now looking at all the different species interacting within a given area. So the sort of the common theme is the habitat and the resources being utilized. They're all targeting those resources, but the scale and scope of that use by different species is different. So you might imagine that a plant uses a certain portion of the habitat, whereas an elephant moving through the jungle might use a very larger swath of that habitat. So that's what we're talking about. We're talking about community ecology. And communities lay in spatial scale somewhere, they have a larger spatial scale than populations, but they're not quite as large as biomes. Biomes are basically latitudinally or geographically derived areas that share similar community structures, so they're even larger in scope and scale. So, for instance, when we talk about biomes, we talk about subtropical deserts, right? There are several subtropical deserts worldwide, collectively forming one biome, but communities would be restricted to specific regions of those deserts in specific areas, so it wouldn't be that big in scale. So there's this sort of intermediate status they have in terms of their size, spatially. And the bread and butter, the sort of the key aspect of community ecology, where everyone seeks to really understand, are these species interactions. And they're interactions between two different species. So we're no longer considering intra-specific interactions. Now we're talking about inter-specific interactions. But we still score them the same way. We score everything. We always go to our fallback accounting system when it comes to scoring things in ecology and evolution. And what's that? Fitness. Very good. All right. So all comes down to fitness. So we can look at the interactions of two species with each other and ask the question, what is the fitness consequence of that interaction for each of the species involved in that interaction? And there's three possibilities, right? A species may gain fitness as a result of the interaction, lose in fitness as a result of the interaction, or experience no effect on its fitness, plus minus zero. And there'll be one of those for each of the species involved in the interaction. So, species interactions are interactions that occur between two different species. And the interaction affects the fitness of both species. There is a fitness consequence that we can assign to that interaction. And the effect might be positive, negative, or neutral. So you can see very quickly that we can come up with a matrix, plus minus 0, right? And come up with all the different combinations of pluses and zeros and minuses. And for each unique combination of signs, we could name a different unique type of interspecific interaction. That's exactly what we're going to do. So there are 5 basic types of interspecific interactions that are recognized when you make this type of matrix. Okay? We're going to go through all of them and tell you what they're called. And then we're going to spend a lot of time giving examples and looking how they work and understanding them. The cornerstones is really the foundation of community ecology. So what are they? Well, this is a chart from your book summarizing them. You have all these different combinations of plus, minuses, and zeros. So I'm going to show you a different chart that I put on the web page that's a little easier. You can have a plus, minus, some combination of plus, minus, right? And there are 3, and collectively we refer to all plus, minus interactions where one benefits in terms of fitness and one loses in terms of fitness as what we call antagonistic interactions. Right? So there's an antagonistic interaction going on. And sometimes they're called consumptive interactions as well. That's another term that's used in the literature. And what you see is there are 3 categories of them we recognize. Predation, herbivory, and parasitism. And in each case, one of the species benefits from the interaction with respect to its fitness, and one loses. The difference is in the consequence of that interaction. So we reserve predation to organisms that consume other organisms and kill them and eat them. We reserve herbivory or grazing to an organism. One organism eats a photosynthetic organism, a primary producer, we're going to call that. That's a very special case. And then the third is parasitism, where one organism consumes part of another organism, but it doesn't typically kill them in the process, at least not right out. Over time, maybe, but not right away. So we're going to go through all three of those when we talk about antagonistic interaction. Then we have the case where we have plus-plus. Win-win. Mutualism. And you might think, oh, this sounds like altruistic interactions, and that's absolutely wrong. No. There's no self-sacrificing behavior here. In mutualistic interactions, both organisms are trying to profit from the other. They don't care a bit about the other's fitness. Couldn't give a whatever about it. Catch myself here. All right. But it's one of these weird cases where they both happen to succeed. So it's a win-win. They both come away with an increase in fitness. Then we have minus-minus. Now you say, what's the point of that? Right? Both interact, both lose fitness. What's the point? Well, there's going to be competition for resources, both intra and interspecific, right? So that's going to happen. But even when you have a minus-minus interaction, it's still possible that there's a winner, right? Who's the winner? The one who loses less, right? Okay? So even in minus-minus competitions, there is a winner usually in those outcomes, and that's the one that experiences a relatively lower decrease in fitness, right? And then you have commensalism. So you have plus 0, and here one organism benefits, but it doesn't have an effect on another. Again, we'll show you some specific examples of those. Mutualism, commensalism, we'll talk about on Wednesday. Susie will talk about those. Okay. But then there's commensalism, and that's a hard one to understand. That's 0 minus. What's the point? Right? Okay. One who suffers, and it sounds like spite to me, right? Okay. It's not. And we'll give you an example. So here on the top panel, we have a Cape buffalo, and it's in the Serengeti, probably, in East Africa. What biome is that? Grassland, right? Okay, very good. I feel like that guy from Ferris Bueller's Day Off. Anybody? Grassland, correct. So, you see all kinds of interactions going on there. You've got your oxpecker, that's a real bird, sitting on a buffalo, picking off parasites, right? So, the oxpecker is getting all kinds of benefit from that buffalo, protection and a meal, right? But the buffalo is benefiting too. That oxpecker is removing parasites from it and lowering its resource loss to parasites. So that's a mutualistic interaction. Of course, the buffalo is grazing grass. That's a classic antagonistic interaction. Plus minus. Buffalo wins, grass loses. Right? And then you've got a bunch of birds hanging out underneath the buffalo. Buffalo doesn't care one way or the other. Neither benefits nor is harmed by those birds scampering around its feet. But that buffalo is doing two things. Keeping predators away from the birds, because they're not going to approach that big old mean buffalo with the horns. And moving around, it's going to dislodge insects, which makes it easier for them to catch them and eat them. So they benefit from that easier feeding. So they benefit at no cost to buffalo. By the way, those insects, every once in a while the buffalo steps on one, right? Pretty sure it doesn't have any fitness consequence on the buffalo, right? But pretty dramatic fitness consequence on that bug, right? Being squashed tends to lower your fitness. So there's all these different interactions occurring here. Now we zip all the way over to the New World, to the, probably the taiga, that would be the biome right now. Got some wolves and a grizzly bear, right? And the wolves have killed the carcass, and so that's classic predation. Kill the animal or eat it. Plus the wolves, minus the elk, right? But the bear comes along and says, I'd like a little piece of that, and all of a sudden now, there's a big fight that's going to break out. And teeth will be bared, and claws will go flying, and people are going to get banged up and nicked up, and there's going to be some fitness consequence to both the bear and the wolf. There's a fight. But eventually, somebody's going to run away, and there'll be a winner. So that's competition for that carcass. is this chart right here. All 5 of those interactions. By the way, the one matrix we leave out is what? 0, 0. So what's the point of talking about that? Nothing interesting there, right? Okay. So, all right. So we don't talk. There's no name for 0, 0 interaction. By its definition, it's really an interaction. So the way to basically characterize these in a graphic context is to list each species A and B, and by virtue of an arrow and a sign, plus, minus, or 0, show what fitness impact one is having on the other. So in commensalism, A is having no fitness impact on B, but B is having a positive fitness impact on A. Now you don't have to write this down because this page will be posted on the web page. You've got to just watch and learn. Okay? But if you want to write it down, that's fine too. In competition, both A and B are exerting negative fitness influence on each other. In commensalism, A is not having any fitness consequence on B, but B is having a negative fitness consequence on A. In consumption or antagonistic interactions, B has a positive fitness consequence on A, and A has a negative fitness consequence on B. In mutualism, A has a positive fitness consequence on B, and B has a positive fitness consequence on A. So that's how we graphically depict these interspecific relationship categories. Okay? I like this way of putting it better than a matrix table, that you actually get the sense of what one is doing with the other. All right, let's start with competition, because so much of community ecology was really born from a study of competitive interaction. It's sort of like the core of much of community ecology. Competition is what it's all about. Remember, it's a minus-minus matrix, right? Each species has a minus consequence on the other. So what that means is that both, and by the way, I always make sure to put it out. How many people have looked at that SPP period and said, what the hell is that? Okay. If you have, that's just a shorthand for species, right? SPP is species. We like to do that rather than write out species. I've been trying to go back through my notes and write out species every time so it doesn't get confused. But just in case you've been confused, it just means species. It's a shorthand version of species. So species, both of them are experiencing a fitness as a consequence of that interaction. Now, one really key yes? But means one species, species singular. SPP means species plural. Problem is they both end in S, so unless you designate what one is, okay. Okay. Now, a key concept in ecology is this concept of the niche. Now, we've talked about niches before. We've talked about a kind of definition of a species as an ecological species. Ecological species had unique niches. And competition has been a major component of identifying and describing various species niches, because by looking at competitive interactions, we understand the breadth of a species niche sometimes. It's not the only component. All the other interactions go into a species niche as well, depending on whether or not they have those types of interactions. But it is a central one. So a lot of what we understand about this concept of niche comes from work looking at interspecific competition. And what is a niche? It's basically the sum total resources used by a species. That's actually an incorrect usage. Not by species, not a species. That's plural. So I should just write it down. Not have to worry about it. Lesson learned. So basically, it's everything it eats, it's where it lives, what it can tolerate, who its predators are, who its prey is, what kind of diseases, what kind of resistance it has to toxins. It's a basically exhaustively detailed ecological job description. That's what a niche is. Everything you want to know about that organism is embodied in this niche. And of course, evolutionary theory says that each organism, each species, has to have a unique niche. Over time, it's been crafted to have a unique niche. So it's the range of conditions it can tolerate. That's more of an abiotic factor, right? Temperature, moisture, chemicals, whatever. and it's species and interaction. And so species that have overlapping niches, if two species have a portion of each of their niche that overlaps, that's a part of the environment they both utilize, right? And so we know for at least that portion of overlap, there's going to be competition for those resources. The species will compete for those portions of their niches that overlap, whether it's food resources or habitat they live in or whatever. Okay? So what happens as a consequence of that competition? That's a good question. Now, there's this notion called the competitive exclusion. I'll just go out and propose it in the 20s, a guy named Gauss, right? Okay. I will never ask you who proposed the competitive exclusion principle on your exam. It's nice if you know it, but I'd rather you know what it is than who proposed it. Right? Like I said, these are the kinds of things that even Wikipedia gets right. So, he hypothesized that it would be impossible for two species to have exactly the same niche and coexist. Why? Because over time, one would outcompete the other for the niche and drive it to extinction. That's what he referred to as the competitive exclusion principle. So the superior competitor will exclude the inferior competitor from that portion of the niche that overlaps. And if the whole niche overlaps, that's bad news for the inferior competitor, isn't it? Right? Okay. So, if you're a little mom and pop hardware store and Home Depot sets up next door, right? Unless you sell something in your store that they don't have, you're going out of business. Okay? Pretty much. That pretty much happens anytime, right? Let's not get into ethical economics. Hard enough dealing with the power. All right. So here's the, remember those two paramecia? I told you these guys would be back. They'd propel themselves back into life. That was when they were grown individually in culture, and they demonstrated what type of growth here. Just be logical about it. Logistic growth. Very good. Okay. Remember logistic growth, that S-shaped curve where they balanced out and reached a carrying capacity. Now let's make it spicy. Let's put them together and see what happens, right? Okay. Like cage fighting. This is what happens when you put them together. Bam! They first start to grow, but what happens to the green guy?
Dies.
They go extinct, basically. They go to zero. They don't maintain the previous care. But look at something else. It's a real sharp, I'm going to just ask you, anyone picked it up? Any of those really, really sharp ones out there? What's different about purple? Is that the same as before?
No.
What's different?
Kind of like stayed. Didn't grow.
Here. Give you one quick look. Bam! Bam!
It decreased. It decreased.
Anybody?
It decreased.
Huh?
It decreased.
Less. So what decreased? What is that number? K. See where K was before?
Carrying capacity.
Maybe 475. Now it's down around 350. Right? Why? Because there was resource depletion by both species, which means that fewer purples can be sustained on those resources. Right? So if you're a paramecium, fewer of them got to reproduce and have offspring. There's a fitness consequence for purple as well. Right? It was just less than for green. Green went extinct. Purple just had their overall numbers lowered somewhat. Right? So both lost some degree, but not equally. Who's the loser here?
Green.
Green, right? Can everyone see it? Why the green paramecium is the loser under this condition?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah? You don't see that?
I said it's gone.
Gone, yeah, that's a pretty big loss. So what we have here is a complete overlap of their two niches, right? There's nowhere to run in that test tube, right? Everyone's in there eating the media. You can't, ciliate off to greener pastures. So whoever's better at getting that media is going to win. So this brings up an interesting concept about competition. In terms of the fitness effect of competition, there are two ways of categorizing the fitness effects of competition. We know that if it's competition, automatically what's true of the fitness consequence on both species? Both of them are going to have their fitness lowered, right? But what's different in these two categories is the relative amount of effect. So what you see is you can have symmetric competition. And in symmetric competition, each species experiences a similar reduction in their fitness. It affects them both equally. Each species experiences the same decreases in fitness as a result of the competition. Is there a winner in this scenario? No. But in asymmetric, one S, two M's, get it right. Okay. If you use two S's and one M, you spell something entirely different. Okay. Here, one species experiences a greater fitness decrease than the other. Mm-hmm. Now, the example we just saw with Paramecia, which was that an example of? Symmetric or asymmetric?
Asymmetric.
Asymmetric, absolutely. Purple had less of a fitness decrease than green. Now, most competition in nature is asymmetric. There are very few examples of two separate species that are exactly equally weighted in their ability to compete for a resource and experience the same decrease in fitness when they interact. Most of them, one is better than the other. So asymmetric competition is much more common than symmetric competition. And it must be asymmetric competition if the competitive exclusion principle is to occur, right? Because if there's not a clear superior competitor, then neither one will be completely excluded, right? But if there's a superior competitor, they'll win and the other one will be excluded. Yes?
So was Johnson accurate in saying that?
No, because he observed most of nature, and most of nature is asymmetric. So essentially it works. There are always exceptions to prove the rule, right? And again, competition is such a complex thing that we tend to chop it up in bits and look at one bit. You might find one bit that's asymmetric in nature, but if you consider anything in totality, you're never going to find two exactly the same. All right, so coming back to this example, another way we could talk about fitness consequences graphically is to take this information and make some plots and see which one applies. Here we have two plots. One plot you have the fitness of species A alone and species B alone, and then in the middle you have the fitness of species A and B when they're grown together. Okay? And what you can see is the relative change in fitness as a consequence of the competition. How much the green and purple decreased from where they were when they were grown along. Okay? And in this example, here's an example of asymmetric competition. You see both of them had a decrease in fitness, but the decrease in green was much greater than the decrease in purple. Whereas here, purple and green decreased exactly the same amount. It was symmetric competition. Now, which one of these accurately represents the example we gave? Asymmetric. See? Because purple had higher fitness than green. Green went extinct. So, it's an example of asymmetric competition. So, competitive exclusion occurs when competition is asymmetric. You've got to have a winner and a loser. A better competitor and an inferior competitor. Make sense, everybody? All right. Now, how do we use this to sort of inform our understanding of a niche? out there that are the big, multinational conglomerate corporations that have gobbled up everything and driven everyone else to extinction, right? Why aren't there just a few big, badass, superior competitors out there? And all the other inferior competitors have been driven to extinction. Well, sometimes that does happen in unique cases, but that's later in this series of lectures. The answer is because most species don't have niches that completely overlap. So if your niche doesn't completely overlap with a superior competitor, when you find yourself in the presence of that superior competitor, you have a bailout refuge. You have somewhere you can go where that competitor doesn't exist, where you can get the resources you need. That make sense to everybody? So how would we depict that graphically? Well, let's say two conditions, two species, at some time one. And each species, species one, species two, are represented as occupying a certain niche. The breadth of their niche represents the breadth of the base of the curve they utilize. And you can see species 2 has a much broader niche than species 1. But there are regions of species 1 and species 2 niches that don't overlap. Right? Wherever you don't have the purple, where you have only red or blue, those are portions of each of those niches that don't overlap with the other. Now, you come back sometime later and you find out now species 1 has this distribution and species 2 has this distribution. From this data, who is the superior competitor?
Both.
Both?
The blue.
Species 1, they drove species 2 out of the portion of their niche that overlapped, didn't they?
Mm-hmm.
Species 2 has now become constrained to that portion of its niche that wasn't occupied by species 1. Species 1 is clearly the dominant competitor here. Its distribution really hasn't changed much from time 1. But the distribution of species 2 certainly has. It's narrowed and moved to that portion that didn't overlap with species 1. Okay? Now this kind of idea, here's another example. Let's say we have species, the orange species, and it eats 3 sizes of seed. It can eat little seeds, medium, small, medium, and seeds, but it cannot eat large seeds. And you know now why? Because the CAM4 and what was the other one? I forget what it is now. The genes that turn on the bills to grow deep and long, right?
Okay.
Yeah, were different in the two, and so one has a big old honker that can eat big seeds, but it can't really eat little seeds. Now, so the small beak one can eat 3 of these seed sizes. The big beak one can eat only 2, right? So they only overlap in their niche in one seed size, right? The medium-large seed size, right? That's the only one they will compete with each other for, correct? Anyone see that? Mm-hmm. So we could ask the question, what happens over time to the distribution? If the bigger beak one was a better competitor for those second largest seed class, what would you expect to happen? The amber or orange curve would shift over the first 2 seed sizes, right? But what if the orange one was a superior competitor for that seed size? Then you would expect the red curve to shift over just the largest seed size. But either one of those species has a refuge in their niche that they can escape from the other one if it's a superior competitor. Now this kind of thinking has generated a key concept in ecology, and that's the concept of a fundamental versus realized niche. And basically what a fundamental versus realized niche is where you can live versus where you actually do live. Right? One is always going to be broader in scope than the other. A fundamental niche is the total possible use of the environment by a species. It's everywhere it could live. So it's largely set by abiotic factors and physiological tolerances of that species. Right? There's sort of a maximum potential every species has as to where it lives, as a function of what temperatures or moisture or resources it needs. But then you start throwing in other species that compete for those resources, and pretty soon you find that that species doesn't always occupy its total potential niche. It's excluded from a lot of its niche often by other species. And so that's what we call the realized niche. And that's the actual observed use of the environment by a species. And almost invariably, I can't think of a single example in which an organism's fundamental niche is not larger than an organism's realized niche, where you actually find it, because competition is constantly, and other interspecific interactions, predation and things like that, is a constant in the environment, and so organisms are always being excluded from a portion of their niche. Yes?
Supposed to say use or use.
Actual observed use. Yes, you're right. You're right, no. Use, it's all. Time is relative. At least that's what Einstein said. Good picture. Thank you. All right. So here's a picture from your book of some very elegant research done by a interesting retired emeritus faculty member at the University of California, Santa Barbara, Joe Connell. Did some work in Scotland on barnacles. Now you roll right over in the intertidal. Wherever there's a rocky intertidal, you find barnacles. It's the reality. And anywhere where it's temperate, you find this particular variety of two species of barnacles. And of course, leave it to your book to get it right. No, wrong, right? It's not big gray barnacles and little white barnacles. It's big white barnacles and little gray barnacles. But I guess something got lost in translation, right? And so there are these two distinct species of these acorn barnacles. One's named Balanus. They got that right, so I'll give them credit for that. It's the big barnacle, and Famulus is the little barnacle. And you go around the world, worldwide, you find that these guys have very distinct zones. Balanus always occupies a band lower than Famulus, right? They have very distinct zonation in the intertidal. And these guys are periodically covered and uncovered by the tides. And the little barnacle lives higher in the tidal range, and the big barnacle lives lower in the tidal range, which means that the little barnacle gets uncovered for more of the month and exposed to the air than the big barnacle. So I said, what's structuring this distribution? Is it purely physiological tolerances, or is there something else at play? So he did some measurements, and he looked at where larvae of the two settled. And what he found was larvae of the big barnacle, the red bar, the farthest one, settled over a broad range of the intertidal, way up high to way down low. But he found that the adults actually lived in a narrower range of the tidal zone. So there were barnacles, larvae that were settling that weren't making it. And then he looked at the little barnacle, and he found that also the larvae settled over a wide range, a little bit higher, but over a wide range, but the adults occupied a narrower zone than the larvae, which is the middle. He also found that certain larvae that settled never made it because they got too dry. They couldn't survive that hot. And so that's represented by the red inverted triangle and the blue one. And you should notice right away that the blue one is shifted slightly higher than the red one, meaning that from that alone you can infer that the little barnacles can tolerate more desiccation than the big barnacles. They can tolerate higher levels of being out of water for longer periods of time. So he asked, okay, does the perceived distribution of adults versus juveniles, is that a function purely of where the larvae settle? No. Is it a function of where the larvae survive? No. Because larvae can survive just fine down low, but we don't find adults there, right? So what's going on? Is there some sort of competitive interaction that's structuring these two bands? So he did a very interesting experiment. He took a rock with little barnacles only in the higher tidal zone, and he transplanted it to the lower tidal zone. And for each rock he transplanted, on half the rock, he did nothing. But on the other half of the rock, every time he saw a big barnacle grown, he would remove it. And he looked and saw what happened to the survival of the little barnacles in those two treatments, right? So the treatment he's testing is the competitive interaction between big and little barnacles. If you remove the competitor, you shouldn't have any effect on that interaction. But if you allow the predator to establish, you should see the effect of that competition. I'm not the predator, the competitor. And what did he find? He found that if you remove the competitor, the little barnacles survive just fine down there. No problem, right? But if you allow the predators to grow, they didn't survive. Why? Because they were overgrown by the competitor. They were a better competitor for that space, that resource. And they got smothered and removed. So he concluded that these barnacles were being excluded from part of their fundamental niche by the superior competitor, the bigger barnacles. The little barnacles were being excluded from the lower portion of their niche by superior competitors, barnacles. Now, subsequent work found that, but they had an out. They could escape to that portion of the tidal range where the big barnacle couldn't survive. That was their bailout refuge. That was their escape niche. And so they were largely restricted to that area. And they weren't able to grow in the portion of their niche they could grow in if that competitor wasn't there. Now he found out that the same, don't think the big barnacles got it all nice and easy, right? Okay? Because things are after it. So it turns out that other things, mussels, are better competitors than big barnacles for space. But they have even less tolerance to being out of the water. So down at the lower portion of the big barnacle range, they're being excluded by mussels. And predators. There's a species of dogwell that preys on the barnacles as well, that excludes it from down low, which cannot survive being out of the water. So even the big barnacles were being restricted from their fundamental niche by other interspecific interactions lower in the tidal zone. So basically, a summary slide, I'll be posting the summary slide on the webpage, so just try and follow this. This black bar, if you look at tidal range, from low tide, very little exposure every month to the air, to high tide, very much exposure. You can see that barnacle larvae for both species, the little barnacles and big barnacles, settle over a broad range of the intertidal. But a bunch of them don't survive at the very highest region. They die from desiccation. Those larvae never survive. And a bunch of them don't survive in the lower zone because they're either overgrown by a superior competitor or overgrown by another competitor, in the case of mussels, or preyed on by whales. Right? So you can see each species are occupying a smaller portion of their niche than they potentially could in the absence of competitors or predators. Their fundamental niche is larger than their realized niche. And so the way to summarize that is this would be their fundamental niche where they could live, indicated by red. It's a very broad band of the intertidal. But where they actually live is actually a very much smaller portion. They only occupy a portion of their fundamental niche, their realized niche. This will be posted all this week. Does everyone understand how this illustrates this concept of fundamental versus realized niche? If you have a question, it's fine. Good time to ask it. Yes?
There are obviously many other examples
Sure.
of similar overlap.
Absolutely. All right. Now, there's another way we categorize competitive interactions, not with regard to the type of fitness impact that's achieved, but the nature of the competition. So there are two broad categories of competition in terms of how the competition occurs that your book talks about. One's what we call interference competition. And we've just seen a great example of that. One interferes with another one and prevents it from obtaining a resource. So the example we just saw, barnacles, is a classic example of interference competition. Species interfere with another use of the resource. There's a direct prevention, sort of one species exerts on the other from utilizing that resource. And I'll show you some examples of that. Most competition winds up being some form of interference competition. But there's also exploitation competition, where you don't really interfere with another's utilization of the resource. You're just quicker at getting yours, right? So how many of you have been there, at the dinner table where there's a fixed number of something really good to eat, and And the fast eater always gets more helpings, right? Because they eat theirs, because the rule is you can only get another one when you finish yours, right? Okay, so maybe 4, and you just finished one. You go to get your second one. How many of you know that experience, right? All right, okay. So that's what exploitation competition is. Species both utilize a resource, but the one who utilizes it more efficiently wins. Better at the acquirement. They get more quicker. The lion's share of the resource. They don't prevent the other from trying to get it, right? Interference competition would be if you reached on the plate for that, they'd reach over and smack your hand or stick a fork in it or something. Okay? All right. That would be interference competition. No, you're free to take whatever's there. Oh, sorry, I ate the last one. Okay. All right. So it's a subtle difference, but functionally it's mechanically or mechanistically it's a difference. So let's look at some examples of these things. These are all examples of interference competition. So here, bunch of particles settle in cover space. That is no longer open space. They're preventing anything else from setting there, right? It's like, when you go and put a bunch of, your bag and your sweater and, your hairpin on a seat in a movie theater. Oh, sorry, taking it, right? Okay. So that's interference competition. You've all practiced it. Or overgrowth. So here's this fern. It's casting its leaves over. It's getting sun, but it's also shading the ground underneath it. It's preventing any plant down there from getting light to grow up. Because if, God forbid, a plant can grow up and get above that fern, the tables will be turned, right? And now it will be the beneficiary of overshading or competition. Here's interference competition, right? Okay, where a hyena and a vulture are both competing for this carcass, but the hyenas are constantly chasing away the vultures until they're done. Okay, that's interference competition. I love that picture because you just know that hyena is going for it, has its head fully up into the peritoneal cavity of that zebra, taking off big chunks of the liver. Probably the liver's gone. That's the first thing that the predator that actually killed this animal eats. So, but that shows commitment to your prey. What he has. And my favorite is this. This is chemical competition. It's a form of interference. Here's this plant. It can grow there, and it kind of puts all this toxic chemical, right, in the soil that it can tolerate, but no one else can. So it's chemically preventing anyone else from moving in. It's sort of like if you wanted a lot of space, you could make the environment unpleasant for anyone else. Another form of chemical interference. Yes?
What did you say the
overshading or overgrowth. Yeah. Which is essentially what the barnacle did in the small one. It overgrew it. And when you overgrow it, you can't feed. And that tends to have dire consequences on your long-term survival. Okay. This would be an example of exploitation competition. A whole bunch of different trees. They all got roots in the soil. Right? They're all tapped into water and nutrients, but whoever's more efficient at extracting it's going to win that contest. No one's preventing the other one from trying to extract the nutrients. It's more of an efficiency thing. Who can extract the water and the nutrients from the soil better? And who can go deeper and get them, whatever. Okay. Here's another example of competition. Two species, a finch and a bee. They both feed on the nectar of cactus flowers, right? And what you find is, when finches live on islands in which bees are absent, they spend a proportionally larger amount of their time feeding on nectar. Right? Nectar comprises a more substantial component of their diet. They still eat seeds, but they supplement quite a bit with nectar. But on islands in which bees are present, you find that finches largely avoid feeding on nectar. They spend all their time feeding on seeds. Because the bees are probably more efficient in extracting the nectar, and they certainly probably interfere with the birds. Remember, bees are with stingers, right? So birds probably say it's not worth it messing with those bees to get some nectar. We'll just eat seeds. Right? So here's an example where the birds on islands with bees present occupy what? A larger or smaller as a virtue of competition. All right, what about consumption? Or antagonistic interaction. Here, one species consumes all or part of another. So there's a clear breakdown of the fitness consequences. Consumer, winner, consumee, loser. Right? So it's really just a matter of degree or what you're consuming that breaks down the subcategories of this. So basically, there are three ways this can happen. It's all plus minus. But we could talk about herbivory, and that's a special case where the consumer is a grazer and the consumee is a photosynthetic organism, either a plant or an algae. Anything that photosynthesizes to produce. What we call a primary consumer grazes on either plants or algae. And the reason we distinguish that, I mean, technically it's kind of a form of predation, but not necessarily, because herbivory doesn't necessarily kill the plant. The plant may survive, but it's not parasitism either. It's kind of unique. It might kill the plant, but it doesn't always kill it. Then there's parasitism, and we'll look at that, in which the consumer consumes a small amount of the tissue of the host, but generally not enough to kill it, at least not outright. The idea is, we can milk this for a while here. Once I kill it all right, this is our gravy train for a long time to come. And then there's predation, where the organism consumes part or all of it, but the consequence of the consumption is the death of the other organism. So let's look at all three of those in a little more detail. So in herbivory, a grazing organism, called herbivore, consumes plant tissue. The plant is used in the most generic terms. We would put in true plants and other photosynthetic organisms like algae or phytoplankton. Any of those would qualify for grazing. So here are two examples of grazers in the same biome, worlds apart. One is in North America and one is in Africa. Right? Both grazing on this grassland biome. And they don't kill the grasses. They cut them back. It's very short. The grasses regrow, so it's not doesn't kill the consumer. But certainly there's a fitness consequence to having a lot of your biomass grazed away. So the grass has a negative effect. There's a positive effect on all disease. Parasitism. A parasite consumes a relatively small amount of tissue from a plant or an animal host. So here's the classic parasite right there, mosquito. Loading up, right? May not seem like a big deal, right? You know, you can take a little blood, no big deal, right? Well, what if 1,000 of those have a little meal on you? You might feel a little lightheaded after that, right? Okay. And you say, well, that never happened. Oh, right. How many of you have been in a situation where you got that many mosquito bites, right? Okay. Tell me you didn't have a fitness consequence from that experience, okay? All right. Of course, it's always fun to try and see if you can, supercharge that mosquito. You get them a bite and just kind of pump. You see them gorge up, and of course the urban myth is you can make them explode. You can't do that. Sorry, that's venous blood, low pressure. You're never going to do that. But you can get them so darn overloaded that it's funny as hell to see them fly. And then you just kind of go. You get this huge blood Rorschach pattern.
Ew.
Priceless things to do when you have nothing to do. An area with a lot of mosquitoes. But my favorite parasite, of course, is the leech. And of course, the greatest leech example from Hollywood is, and everyone says, let me hear it. What do you think?
Anacondas.
Huh?
Anacondas.
Anaconda?
No, in the movie, when they're in the lake, the guy comes up with
the leeches? No. Usually, that's the first.
Oh,
Usually
okay.
people say stand by me, right? But there's actually better. I'm an old school kind of guy. The African queen. There you go. Humphrey Bogart has to go in and free the boat and gets covered with leeches, right? So those are all parasites. And they're getting them off the salt, and they probably get the last one off, and the boat gets stuck. All right, predation. Here a predator kills and consumes all of most of the other organisms, right? And you see those lying technically, nothing's been consumed in the other photograph. I see, I think we all know where this is going. Right? Maybe that seal can get away. Sure, maybe. Right? Maybe it's going to be a half seal after the next incident. So that's both examples of predation, and neither one survives the encounter. All right, now, when you have consumption, invariably there will be defense from that consumption. So the prey don't just sit there and take it, right? Well, some do, but some come up with ways to thwart the predator. So prey evolve defenses to counter predators, try and prevent this. And so there's this constant evolutionary arms race between predator and prey. Predators target prey, prey evolve defenses to counter predators, predators come up with counter tactics to avoid the defenses, and you've got an arms race, right? And there are two basic categories of defense that prey have. One is called constitutive defenses. And constitutive defenses are always there. They're always present. You are locked and loaded at all times and ready to go. Whereas inducible defenses are only produced when there's a reasonable anticipation of having to use them. Now, how is that possible, right? Well, you might ask, why not? Why risk it? Why not just have that defense all the time? Why even risk it? Anyone? Yes. That's right. Don't come free. It costs something to make that defense. And anything you put into defense, you take away from growth and reproduction. Okay. I was teaching the wrong class for a minute. So, you're going to balance your investment in defense to achieve the maximum fitness, right? Because you might say, "Oh, I'll just get the defense when I need it." But if you can't respond quickly enough, that's not going to be very good for your fitness. Right? It's kind of like insurance, right? Wouldn't it be nice if you knew exactly the amount of time you have to have the insurance before it becomes valid, before you have to buy it, right? Wouldn't it be nice if you could turn on your computer and say, "You will have a car accident at 12:42 next week on Wednesday," right? So you wait till Tuesday, you buy that car insurance, right, for a day, right? Get a pretty good rate, and you can cover it. You go, right? Doesn't work out. Right? So that's kind of the way it's in nature. So what are some examples of defense? Well, camouflage is an example. You invest energy into looking like a piece of the body, and it makes it hard for the predator. See, that would not be one example of a constitutive defense. And here's another example of camouflage. Look a lot like a piece of tree bark or a leaf, right? Now, every bit of energy they put into looking that way is energy that they didn't put into reproduction. Cost of fitness. But it makes them harder to be seen and eaten. So it might be a gain, net gain. Schooling, that's a behavioral defense. When you school, you protect yourself from predators two ways. A, it's harder to target an individual in a school. Have you ever tried to focus on a single fish in a school of fish? It's hard, right? Very confusing. But B, I'd much rather be a fish in a school than all on my own when a predator came along, because you kind of spread the risk out there, right? You amortize the risk. So schooling is a type of constitutive. You can actually have weapons, right? You can have a way of fighting back.
Wouldn't schooling be an invisible defense?
No, they're always schooling.
Okay.
Yeah,
They're always
school. Yeah.
Okay.
Now, sometimes the defense is advertised. You want people to know you have it. We call that apothematism, or apothematic coloration. Have you ever noticed organisms that are bright and loud and obvious, and you say, "Boy, that's dumb. They really stand out in the crowd"?
They want to stand out in the crowd. They're saying, eat me and you'll regret it, okay? It's either you're going to get stung or you're going to die from the toxic tissue that I am, or something along those lines. And they want you to know that. And they advertise it forcefully. So these are warning colorations that advertise the defenses. They basically are a form of communication, saying, you don't want to mess with me, right? It's a form of visual communication. So what are they like? Bright colors or distinct stripe patterns that stand out? Anything that stands out from the background is a form of aposematic coloration. Warning coloration. So here's some examples of aposematic coloration. All of these things are very distinct. That caterpillar, that bug, those aphids, that frog, that newsprint, and all 5 of these species have heavy amounts of toxic substances in their tissue that make them completely unpalatable or sometimes deadly if someone eats it. And they're advertising that. They're saying, do not eat meat. You will not like what you eat. In fact, it will kill you. So that's bright coloration warning. But where there's that kind of communication, there is mimicry. Mimicry is something that constituent defenses have produced. There are 2 types of mimicry. Mimicry is when you look like something else. Right? And you can look like something else because, by gosh, you really are like that something else, and we're going to look together so you recognize that. Or you can look like something else because you want someone to think you're like that something else, so they won't mess with you. So one is truth in advertising, and one is a form of communication that we've learned to be known as. What was that? Deception, right? So, Müllerian mimicry is the real deal. Species with similar defenses resemble each other. Hey, if we've all got this defense, let's come up with a uniform warning so that every time someone sees that warning, they'll know. And you've all experienced this. If you go outside and something yellow and black striped buzzes by you, you instantly flinch. Why? Because you associate that coloration with what?
Bees.
Stings, right? Everything that's got a sting is some version of yellow and black, right? So avoid yellow and black because it's going to sting you. And all those bees and wasps, they all have stingers. They're telling the truth when they look like each other visually. But there are those out there that are gaming the system. Those are hate seeds. These are species that lack the defenses, but look like those who have it. They're hoping to fool you into leaving me alone. Oh, you don't want to mess with that guy. He's got a sting. But he doesn't. So that's deception. But to persist, what? Anyone? It's got to be rare. So Batesian mimics are not abundant. They make it out in the margins, in the fringes. The minute they get too abundant, it doesn't work anymore, does it? Well, what are some examples of Batesian mimics and Müllerian mimics? Well, here's a wasp, a bumblebee, and a honeybee. They all look similar coloration patterns, and they all have stings. So they are advertising their stinging with this coloration pattern. Now here's a hornet moth, a wasp beetle, and a hoverfly that look just like those coloration patterns. No sting. They're hoping to fool you into leaving them alone. Okay. So that would be one example. Close-up of the hoverfly and the common wasp. Markedly similar, aren't they? Now, do you think hoverflies are super abundant everywhere you go? No, they're very rare. Butterflies do it. So here are a bunch of butterflies from South America. Each butterfly in the column resembles each other. These guys resemble each other, these two resemble each other, these guys resemble each other, these guys. And they did palatability tests, and they tested the palatability of butterflies to birds. And they ranked them as highly unpalatable, yuck, moderately unpalatable, still yuck, highly So that's an example of this guy and this guy are Mullerian mimics. This guy is a Batesian. Watch out for those guys, sneaky little guys. All right, let's just try and finish conducible defenses. I'm going to take you right to the limit today. Here it's a variable response, right? And it's triggered by the presence of predators. There's some mechanism to get some forewarning to let you know there'll be a predator. So now it's time to invest in some defense. So all the time there wasn't a predator, I wasn't wasting energy on defense, I was putting it towards fitness. Increasing my fitness. But now, hey, the barbarians are at the gate. It's time to ramp up the defenses, right? Because the defense, remember, represents a fitness cost. So if you can avoid paying that cost, you're going to benefit. But it doesn't work unless you can avoid the consequence of not having that defense when the predators are around. So inducible defenses, what they do is they minimize fitness costs. So that you're only spending the energy on defense when you need to, and not when you don't. But as you might imagine, that's a hard balance to strike, to get right. If you mess up on your timing, and you've just wasted everything. All right, so let's see how this works. And a great example of this is seen in mussels that have defenses against predators. And one such predator is crabs. So blue mussels are from New Zealand. Crabs eat them. Now a mussel has two defenses against a crab. What a crab will do is it'll pick a mussel off the ground and then chip away its shell to expose the soft insides, right? So there's two ways a mussel can ramp up its defense. One would be to make itself more strongly attached to the bottom by putting more threads down and making it more firmly attached, harder for the crab to pull it up. And the second is to make a thicker shell, harder to chip through. Both represent an energy investment. Right? So, what they did was they looked and they found that if you go to areas where there's lots of crab predation, you find that the attachment strength of the muscles there is high, strong, and the shell thickness is thicker compared to areas where there's low crab predation. Shells are thinner and the muscles are more weakly attached. Now there's two explanations to this, right? What are the two explanations? One is the mussels beef up their defenses where there's crabs. But there's another equally valid explanation that could explain this data. What? Huh? No, think about it. It has to do with the crabs. They eat the low-hanging fruit. If you're a crab, you're going to eat the weakly attached ones and the thin-shelled ones, and you're going to change the average values in that population. So they did an interesting experiment to test that. They grew some mussels downstream of a tank with no crab, and they grew another set downstream of a tank with a crab. The crab never actually ate the mussels, but the mussels were constantly being bathed in the crab. They can taste that crab. They can detect the chemicals of that crab. And they measured the average shell thickness of these two mussels after a period of time. If mussels were responding to the presence of the predator and thickening up their shells, you say this group would have a thicker shell after a period of time than this one.